Hello. This is the reading of Chapter 5 of Life, Death, and In Between by Saturday Night Frights, and read by Poltergeist. This is a Danny Phantom and DCU crossover. And so, without further ado, please enjoy the fic. Chapter 5. Strange and Unknown. Sometimes, things fall apart so that better things can fall together. Marilyn Monroe. Contrary to the persona he often liked to adopt, Richard John Grayson was not overly trusting, airheaded pretty boy. He was one of the best in his field, in either uniform. Knowing nearly every martial art known to man, was proficient in every type of weapon, fluent in 12 languages, and able to hack into databases with ease. At 28, he could be considered an expert in metahumans, clones, and extraterrestrials just by the sheer number of times he'd had to deal with their bullshit. The past 15 years of his life had not been simple. He left behind shoes too big for any of his brothers to fill. Even with all his experience, Dick wasn't quite sure what to make of the kid sitting in the interrogation room in Gotham's police station. Dick trusted Commissioner Gordon's opinion and judgment on a lot of things. The man was trustworthy, experienced, and Dick could admit that he'd often been the needed outside perspective on a fair few cases. Still, there was an information the man did not know that Dick was privy to. Like the fact that Damien, as Robin, was currently in Jump City, on the other side of the country, playing his part in what was sure to become an ongoing investigation into Hive. The school had reopened earlier that summer, under an unknown new administration, putting most heroes on edge as to what they were planning. In their line of work, a large gathering of untrained meta-teenagers tended not to bode well. Dick's youngest sibling was not expected to return to Gotham for another week. So no, despite Gordon's phone call asserting otherwise, the boy was not Damian Wayne. Cloning was, unfortunately, always a possibility. Connor, the Harper brothers, and numerous Damie doppelgangers had proven that point multiple times over. He could be a clone, but there was a fullness to him, an otherness that the clones Talia sent their way did not have. Dick tilted his head, considering the boy through the small glass window on the door. He unfolded his arms, coming to a decision. Dick turned and smiled at Jim, who had been telling Dick about the events that led up to Damien being arrested. "Mind if I talk to him first?" he asked. Jim gestured towards the door. "Go ahead. Just don't take too much time. It's been a long night." He gave Dick a serious look, brown eyes hard being his horn-rimmed glasses. "Don't be too tough on the kid, Richard. Detective Roberts is doing her job." "Right," Dick said. He knew he could be, in the words of several teenage superheroes, an unrelenting hard-ass when it came to missions and training. This was not one of those instances. He took a deep breath and entered the interrogation room. The kid snapped his head to Dick, pale blue eyes staring unblinkingly at him. Dick put on his friendliest smile and pulled out the chair across from the kid, settling himself down at the small table. He observed the kid for a second, tense and suspicious. It was almost eerie how much he looked like Damien, only that he had Bruce's eyes, that unsettling, pale, whitish blue, ringed with a darker shade. His eyes darted down and quickly glanced at the kid's hands, resting on the metal table, idly picking at his nail beds with dirty, blue-tinted nails. Nervous, even if the boy's expression showed only cautious interest. "Do you know who I am?" Dick asked. "Best to get on with it." The boy arched an eyebrow. "My new parole officer?" he said in a deadpan tone. Dick snorted, but inwardly he was a little taken aback. The clones Talia sent their way always, without fail, had semblances of Damien's memory. If the clone theory was fact, then the kid should have known his name at the very least. "No," he said, keeping the easy grin. "My name's Dick." "Excuse me?" Not Damien said. "It's short for Richard." I don't know how you get Dick from Richard," he quickly interrupted the kid. That was not a road he wanted to go down at the moment. The kid gave him an unimpressed look. Ouch. It had been a while since he'd seen that particular flavor of glare from Damien. Dick cleared his throat and pressed on. "What's your name?" If the kid said anything other than Damien, well, he'd crossed that road when he got there. "It's Danny," he said. "Time to cross that road, Richard." "Just Danny?" Icy blue eyes stared him down. "Daniel, if you want to be formal," he said, and gave Dick a long look. Most people know how to get Danny out of Daniel. Funny. Dick's lips twitched in faint amusement. Well, this was an unanticipated issue. The clones Talia often sent after Damien tended to think they were Damien, as had been the case with Will believing he was the original Speedy. That wasn't to say the boy before him wasn't a clone of his youngest brother. Jim Harper had believed he was his own person. Connor basically was his own person, being more genetically similar to Superman's son than his clone. Still, those three had been the result of Cadmus, an institute that Dick was fairly certain Talia had no connections to. An institute he desperately hoped she had no connections to. Now that he was taking more than a cursory look at Danny, he wasn't an exact match for Damien. At first glance, the two were nearly identical, but as Damien's visage overlapped with Danny in Dick's mind, the boy before him was too pale to be Dick's brother, gaunt and almost sickly, with sweat damping his brow. Dick idly wondered if the kid was actually sick. With the faint flush on his face, it wouldn't be surprising if he had a fever, and his eyes, startling blue instead of Damien's deep green. Then there was the lack of aggression towards him. Sure, the kid was suspicious and fairly cautious, a bit of a smartass too, yet Danny had made no moves of violence or hostility towards Dick, unlike previous iterations with clone Damiens. Unlike Damien himself. If this wasn't another instance of cloning, just what the hell was going on? The kid, Danny, was far too similar in appearance and mannerisms to Damien for it to be a coincidence. Too skittish and untrusting for Dick to just spring him on Bruce, especially considering the cold efficiency that Damien handled his clones with. The slight strain in the boy's eyes every time he dispatched a lookalike, as if it pained him. Dick resigned himself to what was about to happen. The kid would have to come home with him and be kept a secret until Dick figured out what was going on. Danny would need to be kept away from the rest of the family. He couldn't put everyone in danger with an unknown, a possibly hostile and dangerous unknown. At the same time, he couldn't allow that unknown to wander the city, nor could he, in good consciousness, allow a child to remain homeless. Dick would never get another decent night's sleep if he left his baby brother's doppelganger to roam the streets of Gotham. Plus, something about the kid pulled at Dick's heart, caused an itch under his skin that called Dick to help. An incessant tug at something deep in his chest. When he got a call from Gordon that night, this was not what he thought he'd be dealing with. It wasn't often that the commissioner called for Dick Grayson, not Nightwing. Honestly, he'd been worried that some mundane tragedy had happened. A fire at the manor, or maybe one of his siblings had been arrested again. Something that required an Elder Wayne child and not his superhero alter ego. Well, not Damien being arrested counted for both. Didn't it? He was going to knock Jason unconscious for a week out of spite. How dare he escape from so much familiar responsibilities? Jay was second eldest, damn it. Why couldn't he be the one to deal with the sudden possible Damien clones for once? Dick smiled softly at Damien, coming up with a lie that could convince the kid to come with him. Well, Danny, I guess you could say I'm your new foster. Foster? He asked. The kid's dark eyebrows furrowed together as he gave Dick a confused look. Yeah, you didn't think they just let you back on the streets, did you? Dick raised an eyebrow, keeping up the easy, unconcerned adult act. You're facing a pretty serious charge, kid. Another lie. He doubted the kid would be in any legal trouble in the slightest. Temporary placement just until you're in the system. It's either me or the youth shelter, he shrugged. Danny tensed, eyes flitting away to focus on some corner of the room, an expression on his face that reminded Dick of when his younger siblings were caught doing something they weren't supposed to. Unless you'd prefer the youth shelter? The kid shrunk in his seat, sliding down in an attempt to make himself look smaller. He muttered something under his breath. What was that? Dick asked, leaning in a bit closer. Danny cleared his throat, avoiding meeting Dick's eyes. I said, I don't think I can go back. Go back? What do you... Dick paused, narrowing his eyes at the kid shifting nervously in front of him. Dark hair, blue eyes, roughly 15 years old, thin and possibly malnourished, probably injured. Oh, for the love of... Dick sighed. Are you telling me you're the cause of the APB from last week? Danny's eyes quickly looked up from Dick and then away, a subtle admission of guilt. He sighed and leaned back in the metal chair. It was probably the best that circumstances had played out this way, that the kid had been found by the GPD, wrongly recognized as Damien Wayne, and that Dick had been called to pick up his youngest brother. Oracle could clear the APB and social services report. Gordon would have already taken care of the arrest record. They could make it so that the kid's paper trail disappeared. In the event that this was an evil clone situation, it would be better if Danny remained unseen. Easier for Dick to deal with the problem himself, if need be. The man stood with a groan, gesturing for the kid to rise and follow him out of the interrogation room. He led Danny out, keeping a hand on the kid's shoulder. Knowing about the APB from the week before confirmed at least one thing. The kid was a runner. Dick was not about to let him out of his sight, not until everything was figured out. Not until he knew why, exactly. An injured version of Damien was running around Gotham in late August. He waved at Gordon as they passed by. Thanks again, Commissioner, Dick said, keeping a firm grip on Danny's shoulder. He led the boy out into the humid Gotham night. Danny didn't know what to make of the man sitting next to him. He waltzed into the interrogation room Danny was forced into, all tan, good looks, and dimpled grins. Danny was immediately suspicious. He looked at Danny with something like recognition, quick and fleeting. It flashed across the man's deep blue eyes, almost as if he knew Danny, or at least thought he did. It put Danny on edge a bit. Not as much as the fact that something deep down in Danny reached for the man, saw something in him that felt familiar. He didn't like it. Danny wanted to disappear the moment he'd been arrested. He never had the chance. Between being in a police car, shoved into that cramped interrogation room, and manhandled into the man's, Dick, his mom supplied unhelpfully, vehicle, well, he couldn't just turn invisible. Not if he wanted to remain under the guise of a normal teenager. Besides, it wouldn't have helped him escape anyways, not with the accompanying ability of intangibility. He'd been stuck. Now, Danny was certain he'd have to wait for the best moment to vanish. Although under Dick's surprisingly attentive gaze, he wasn't sure when that would be. Danny stared at the man with a furrowed brow, a frown on his face. He crammed himself in against the passenger door, as far away from the other man as possible. He quickly glanced up at Danny from the corner of his eye. "What's up, kid? You're kind of glaring a hole into my head here," Dick said with a smirk, keeping his eyes on the road. "Where are we going?" Danny asked. "Huh, were you not paying attention back there? I told you, I'm your new foster. We're going to my house." Danny glanced at the window, the buildings blurring past as they drove. They had been driving through the city for a while, and he was starting to worry that they had left the city boundary. He'd sank down into the seat and eyed the man. He'd run at the first chance he had. They had stopped on the outskirts of Gotham City, across a bridge onto a smaller island, far away from where Danny had spent the past 2 weeks. He led Danny into an upscale building, into a disturbingly blank apartment, full of expensive-looking furniture that appeared worryingly unused, that felt incredibly unlived in, sterile almost. Danny was starting to become seriously worried that he was about to die again. Dick had basically marched Danny into the back bedroom, idly chatting about Danny getting cleaned up and into a real bed. He'd offhandedly mentioned having a younger brother whose clothes might fit Danny, and left the boy in the room to find said clothes. Once the door clicked shut behind Dick, Danny rushed over to the bedroom's large window. He clawed at the bottom ledge, desperately trying to find a lock or groove he could force open. Despite his struggling, the pane of glass didn't so much as budge. Danny growled under his breath, in irritation, smacking his palm against the window. "Trying to get some fresh air?" Danny jumped in surprise, whirling to face where the voice had come from. Dick stood in the doorway, a bundle of folded clothes in his arms and an amused look on his face. He walked forward and placed the clothes onto the bed's white comforter. "Ensuite bathroom is here," Dick said, walking to the wall adjacent to where Danny stood. He flicked on the lights, flooding the dim room with warm light. "You should take a shower. You'll feel better. Then you should probably get to bed. It's like 3 a.m. Dick walked past, heading towards the bedroom door, glancing down at Danny as he did so. He passed in the entryway, one hand on the door handle. "Oh, and "The windows don't open, just an FYI." He winked at Danny and shut the door behind him. Danny scowled, glancing back at the useless window before locking the door Dick had disappeared behind. "That sounds like a fire hazard," he yelled after the man, feeling irritated and belligerent. "It probably is," Dick shouted back from deeper in the apartment. Danny grumbled and walked around the room. He searched for anything that might be useful, but came up empty-handed. It felt oddly like a hotel room, specifically the expensive ones he stayed in with the Fentons on the rare occasions they were invited to forums and talks. All white and fluffy bedding, white walls, blank of any personal items or pictures. Very clean and neutral. He didn't trust it one bit. There had to be a way out of this place. If the windows wouldn't work, well, Danny could always try the front door. The man had mentioned that it was the very early hours of the morning. Maybe he'd gone to bed himself, leaving Danny completely unattended and able to make his escape. Danny crept towards the door, staying silent and light on his feet. He observed the shadows under the door, the unwavering darkness, no movement, none that he could see. Pressing one ear against the door, Danny listened and waited for a moment. Silence. Nothing but silence. He came away from the door, chewing on his lip as nerves pulled at his stomach. It's fine. One more escape. Nothing to worry about. Slowly, Danny pulled open the door and peered his head out into the apartment living room, only to see Dick Grayson sitting in an armchair facing Danny's door, laptop balanced on his lap and one eyebrow raised as he looked up at Danny. "Need something?" he asked. "Nope," Danny said, quickly shutting the door. He stood motionless in front of the door for a minute, turning and stomping towards the bathroom, uncaring that he was acting childish. If he was going to be forced to stay in his apartment tonight, he was going to waste all the hot water he could. Dick was not making Danny's escape plan easy. He was just always there. 4 times now, Danny had attempted to escape the apartment, creeping out of the room once the sun had barely risen, waiting for a distraction, tried sneaking unnoticed past Dick. He'd even tried outright running. Not only was the man always there, he seemed to have a sixth sense dedicated to Danny, to knowing where Danny was and when he was attempting to flee. It was unnerving. It reminded him of Jazz. The worst part was that Dick almost seemed to be amused by Danny's escape attempts. He didn't even seem irritated or annoyed in the least. Didn't even seem to be concerned that Danny would actually manage to leave. Which, yeah, he was probably right to be unconcerned that Danny would manage to escape, seeing how not only was he unable to get out from Dick's attentive eye, Danny could not figure out a single lock in the place. There were locks everywhere, too, not just in the windows and doors, on cabinets and linen closets. He was starting to feel trapped in a safe house that would put Fenton Works to shame. Still, the less Dick reacted to Danny's antics, the more frustrated Danny became, not to mention that he was odd. Something felt off about Dick that Danny didn't really have the energy to investigate. He hummed, energetically, in a way that reminded Danny of standing too close to Vlad. Only, that wasn't quite a correct comparison. Vlad had felt off in a way that made Danny's skin crawl, like the man was smashed together. Puzzle pieces wouldn't fit. A thing masquerading as a person. He had immediately made Danny uncomfortable, had put him on edge with the pure waves of wrongness. Sam had said that Vlad's vibes were off, which had made sense when Danny found out that while he was a true Happa, Vlad had also been a true ghost, possessing his own slowly decaying body. Dick did not feel like that. He hummed in a way that felt like the denizens of a ghost zone, but that also felt like Jasmine Fenton, who was ecto-contaminated from childhood. It made Danny curious, but mostly he felt infuriated. Where Vlad had put Danny immediately on guard, Dick felt comfortable, safe almost. Being around the man had made Danny feel calm and comfortable and tired. Like if he actually tried to sleep, he'd find that nightmares wouldn't make an appearance when Dick was around. He didn't like it. Didn't like that it made him feel like he was about to slip up. This was absolutely not going to fly. Danny did not have the energy to investigate why the strange man felt the way he did, or how he managed to always know where Danny was, even with Danny being much lighter than a regular human being, not to mention having nearly a decade of experience trained to be an assassin. Danny felt a bit resigned to the fact that he wouldn't escape today. As he was watching Dick pace the apartment, animatedly talking to someone on the phone, he came to a decision. Surely there would be a time in the near future where Dick's attention would slip through enough that Danny could vanish. He would just have to wait until then. Danny stood in the bathroom, barefoot on the cool tile, grimacing at the red splatter in the white sink. He turned on the faucet and got to work clearing out the blood. He leaned forward to take a drink, swishing the water around his mouth to get rid of the iron taste. His chest ached with every breath, and his joints protested with each movement. Danny dragged a damp hand down his face and turned off the faucet. Drying his face with a towel, he looked out at himself in the bathroom mirror. Pale blue eyes shone with determination. He could ignore any issues he was having at the moment. Tonight was the night he'd be able to escape. He spent the past 4 days with Dick, learning nothing about the man other than small quirks. Despite being deceptively fit, the man had a palate of a child and seemed to live off of takeout and sugary ready-made meals. On Danny's second night with him, he had set off the apartment's fire alarm by trying to cook spaghetti. Much to Danny's initial horror and later amusement, the two of them had consumed at least 3 jumbo-sized boxes of various sugary cereals, and if Danny didn't leave sooner, he'd crack and start making pancakes from scratch. He didn't seem bothered by Danny's stubborn refusal to engage in conversation. Instead, Dick had filled the silence with non-ending idle chatter, as if he was used to being the only person speaking in a conversation. He had a truly horrific sense of fashion. On Danny's second day with him, he'd taken the boy to buy some clothes, talking about how his younger brother's clothes wouldn't do for long, that it was important for Danny to have clothing items that belonged to him alone. Now, Danny didn't consider himself an expert in fashion. A simple t-shirt and jeans was his usual go-to as far as outfits were concerned. It was just that Dick selected some truly horrid items that pulled a reaction from Danny, despite him trying to remain impartial. The most important thing that Danny had learned, Dick didn't seem to sleep, or at least had not been out of commission at any point that Danny checked, which was incredibly frustrating. Not that Danny really had any room to say anything. None of these quirks told Danny anything about who the man was, or even why he was bothering with Danny. With Stitches, things had been clearer, easier. It was obvious that the man was only using Danny as a spare kind of hand. Danny knew that his shelter and food was conditional, and he found a degree of comfort in that. Danny wasn't sure what Dick wanted from him. He hadn't made any demands or requests, hadn't even asked any probing questions. Dick offered up kindness and patience without hesitation. It put Danny on edge. No matter, he would leave tonight, before Dick took a turn and decided to hold something over Danny, manipulate him into a situation, or turn him over to the GIW. "Danny," Dick yelled for him, "I'm heading out." Danny padded into the apartment's living room, seeing Dick's smiling face as he stood in the doorway. 2 unfamiliar adults were in the entryway, both giving Danny soft smiles that were probably meant to be reassuring. A tall, red-headed man and a blonde woman with her arm in a cast. "These are the friends I was telling you about, Wally and Artemis. They're going to watch you tonight, okay?" Danny scowled. "I'm not a toddler, you know. I can be left alone." "Right," Dick said, dragging out the word. He shared an unconvinced look with the red-headed man. "Wally." Artemis snorted and wandered into the kitchen. "Don't cause too much trouble," Dick said, giving Danny a pointed look before closing the door, leaving Danny to stare down at Wally, watching as the man shifted awkwardly on his feet. Wally averted his eyes, glancing to where Artemis had appeared. "This is so weird," he muttered under his breath. He knew that Dick, rightfully, didn't trust Danny to be alone. That didn't mean that Danny couldn't feel indignation at being treated like a toddler. Danny had never needed a babysitter a day in his life. It was mildly insulting to have 2 now. "Hey," Wally cleared his throat and threw a thumb in the direction of the kitchen. "Artie and I are going to whip up something for dinner. Do you have any requests?" Danny stared unblinkingly back at him, reaching for the man in that strange, unseen way of his, making shadows and paranoia dance on the edges of Wally's peripheral vision. It wasn't taxing, or even really a display of Danny's abilities. More like winking an eye than anything, but watching the man shuffle on his seat, Danny was taking a small amount of pleasure in making him uncomfortable. Dick seemed mostly unaffected by Danny's ghostisms. It was nice to see he hadn't completely lost his touch. Wally's mouth pressed into a thin line as he nodded his head. "Or you can stay silent. That's cool too." He trailed off. "Artemis." She poked her head around the corner and made eye contact with Danny. "I was worrying about the amount of ingredients in here. Please tell me Dick hasn't been trying to cook again," she said. Danny grimaced, remembering the failed recent pasta. Artemis winced in sympathy upon seeing Danny's reaction. He did, huh? He burned water. How is that even possible? Danny grumbled, his face scrunching up in dismay. Wally snorted. Oh man, I know, right? He's laughably bad in the kitchen. Really. It should be a crime for him to prepare food, he said. Fond amusement colored his voice. Come on, Artemis said. I'll show you how to make the best omelet you'll ever have. She disappeared around the corner. Wally threw a grin Danny's way before following her. Danny stood in place for a moment, eyes flickering back and forth between the front door where the adults had gone to. He could try and leave now, but something whispered that he wouldn't get very far, that it was better to wait until that night to make his escape. He followed them into the kitchen. Hello. I'd just like to say thank you for listening to the end of the video. I really do appreciate it. The first time I recorded this, I was too far away from the mic, so I had to redo it. The second time, the mic was somehow connected to my AirPod, which should have been off. This is the third freaking take, so I sure hope you enjoyed that. Anyways, if you enjoyed the Podfic, you can leave me a like, maybe subscribe. Also, if you have a request for a fic you'd like me to read, please leave a comment to let me know. Anyways, hope you enjoyed. Until next time, this is Poltergeist, signing off.